My Father's House. Chapter 1. The first thing Howie did each morning was study the silence. She would lie perfectly still on her narrow mat, her 13-year-old body tense, and listen. Was it the silence of peace, or the fragile one that promised chaos? Today, it was the latter. The memory of last night, the shouting, the thuds, the choked sobs, her mother had long since abandoned the blatant lie of smoke causing puffy eyes and sniffles, still stuck to the walls like a bad smell. This was when her real routine began. She slipped from her mat, the cold mud floor seeping through the bare soles of her feet. Polo, her 7-year-old brother, was still asleep on the mat beside hers, his face smooth and untroubled. She moved through the dim living room with a practiced stealth. Her mission was clear, to disarm the house. The large kitchen knife belonged in the top drawer, but she never left it there. She tucked it behind the sack of maize flour, its handle cool and dangerous. Next, she took her father's machete and slasher from the windowsill. She wrapped them in a rag and slid them under the sagging sofa. A pair of sharp scissors, hose, one by one, she catalogued and hid them, her movements swift and efficient. But then her heart sunk. One was missing. The small, sharp knife with the black handle. It was always in the basin containing clean utensils, but it was gone. Her eyes darted around the kitchen, panic beginning to prickle at the back of her neck. She checked the drawer, under the cupboard with the good china reserved for guests, behind the sofa. Nothing. Her breath came in short and shallow bursts. This small, stupid knife could become a weapon. It could be the difference between life and death. A small, warm hand slipped into hers. She jumped. Polo stood beside her, his large eyes wide and serious. He put a finger to his lips, just like she always did for him, and led her to the pile of firewood by the 3 cooking stones. He carefully moved a single log and pointed. There, hidden in the dust and ashes, was the black-handled knife. Howie's knees went weak with relief. She pulled Polo into a tight, quick hug. "Good boy," she whispered, her voice thick. "You're such a good boy." She added the knife to its hiding place with the others, her hands trembling slightly. The morning task was over. The process would be repeated before retiring for the night. "Come," she said, her voice returning to its practical tone. "We need to get ready." She stoked the fire in the Jiko and reheated the leftover porridge, slicing a cold, sweet potato to go with it. She sat Polo down and watched him eat, her stomach tight with anxiety. "Eat quickly," she urged softly, her ears tuned to the door of her parents' bedroom. When Polo was finished, she wiped his face and helped him into his school uniform, her fingers fumbling with the tiny buttons. She then crept to her parents' door and pushed it open just a crack. Her mother was lying still under the blanket. In the sliver of morning light cutting through the curtain, Howie could see the dark, harsh bruise on her mother's forehead. She was breathing deeply, the sleep of exhaustion or perhaps escape. Howie closed the door, a familiar ache settling in her chest, a mess of love, pity, and resentment, whether for her mother or father she didn't know. The walk to school was a silent one, Polo's small hand firmly in hers. The sun was already high, and she knew what it meant. They were late. Again. She dropped Polo at the primary school gate with a final squeeze of his hand, then ran the rest of the way to her own classroom. The lesson had already started. The chatter died as she stood in the doorway, all eyes on her. Mr. Amandi looked up from his chalkboard, his expression stern. "Howie, this is the 3rd time this week." "I'm sorry, sir," she mumbled, staring at the floor. "The rules are the rules. You know the price of being late." She did. She nodded, her throat too tight for words. She walked to the front of the class and held out her hand, palm up. She focused on a crack in the wall, detaching her mind as the thin cane came down with a sharp strike. The pain was a sharp sting, but it was a simple one. Chapter 2. For a few precious minutes after school, the world felt almost normal. The sun was a beautiful golden orange. Howie had found a length of old rope and was skipping, her feet finding a steady rhythm on the hard-packed earth. Slap, 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 slap. Nearby, Polo kicked a ball of bundled plastic bags, his small face screwed up in concentration as he aimed for a goal marked by 2 stones. This was the fragile piece. they built for themselves in the hours between school and his return. The peace shattered with the sound of the rusty iron sheet gate creaking open. He was back. The change was instantaneous. Polo froze, the makeshift football forgotten. Howie's rope went slack, falling to the ground like a dead snake. They didn't need to look at each other. Out of pure instinct, they scattered. Polo ducked behind the water tank. Howie hid in the shadow of the cow shed, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. Their father staggered towards the house, his gait unsteady. He didn't call out for them. He never did. From her hiding spot, Howie watched him disappear inside. A moment later, she heard his voice, a low rumble that was somehow more terrifying than a shout. She had to get closer. She had to know. She crept to the window and peered through the open space. Her mother was at the stove, stirring a pot of sukuma wiki. The ugali was steaming in a sufuria beside it. The air was thick with the smell of kerosene from the lit lamp on the table. "Woman, what is this slop?" Her father's voice slurred. "It is what we have, Baba Howie," her mother replied, her voice carefully neutral, flat, trying not to provoke him. "I work all day, and you feed me leaves like a goat. Where is my meat?" "There is no money for meat this week. The children." "Don't you tell me about the children," he roared. What happened next was a blur of violent motion. He grabbed the pot of vegetables and hurled it to the floor. A splash of green, oily water stained the wall. Then came the sufuria of ugali, the dense, white mound hitting the ground with a sickening thud. He turned to the kerosene lamp, and with a sweep of his arm, sent it smashing against the wall. The room flickered in the dying light of the flames before they died out, leaving them in near darkness and the smell of fuel. Howie saw his hands then, big and brutal, close around her mother's throat. Her mother's hands flew up, clawing at his wrists, a desperate, silent struggle. Howie didn't stop to think. She burst through the door, her eyes wild. She scanned the room, grabbed a piece of firewood from the stack, and swung it with all her might. It connected with his back with a dull thud. He grunted, his grip loosening for a second. He turned. And the look in his eyes wasn't anger anymore. It was something colder, something purely murderous. He released her mother, who collapsed, gasping, onto the floor. "You little witch," he shouted. He didn't hit her with his hands. He turned and drove his heavy gumboot into her stomach. The air left Howie's lungs in a whoosh. A searing pain exploded in her stomach. She crumpled to the floor, curling into a ball, coughing. She tasted something thick and salty, and when she wiped her mouth, her hand came away smeared with a shocking, bright red. The sight of the blood seemed to startle even him. In that frozen moment, her mother found her strength. She scrambled up, grabbed Howie's arm, and pulled. "Run, Howie, run." They stumbled out of the house, Polo following close behind, into the cool night, leaving the darkness and the monster behind. They didn't stop running until they reached the safety of the sugarcane plantation, the tall, rustling stalks swallowing them whole. The night was long and cold. Howie shivered, each breath a sharp reminder of the kick. Her mother held her, rocking gently, her own throat marked with ugly, dark bruises. They didn't speak. There was nothing to say. When the first light of dawn colored the sky, Howie knew what she had to do. She had to go to school. It was her only escape, her only future. Leaving her mother in the field, she walked back to the house. It was silent now. She stood before the front door, her body trembling with a cold that had nothing to do with the morning air. She raised a small fist and knocked softly. "Baba," she called, her voice low. "Baba, please open the door. I just need my uniform. I need to go to school." There was no answer. Chapter 3. It was a day of good fortune. Mama Ashino's favorite cow, the one she bragged about more than she did her own children, had fallen ill and had to be slaughtered. And in the economy of their village, a dead cow was a sad but practical fortune for everyone else. Howie's mother had returned from their neighbors with a small, precious bundle wrapped in banana leaves. It was more meat than they had seen in months. The air in the house was different that evening. There was a nervous, hopeful energy, like lighting a single candle in a dark room. The smell of frying onions and boiling meat was a strange, celebratory smell that almost, but not quite, masked the ever-present fear. Howie watched her mother prepare the meal, a small sufuria of stew and a large, firm ugali. Polo, sensing the significance, kept peeking into the pot, his eyes wide. "He will be happy today," their mother whispered, more to herself than to them. Howie said nothing. She knew the shifts in her father's moods were more complex than meat. When the gate creaked, the usual freeze happened. But tonight it was coupled with a new hope. He entered and his nose twitched. He smelled it immediately. "Woman!" he bellowed, but for once it wasn't a snarl. It was a demand for an explanation. "We have meat, Baba Howie," her mother said, a small smile on her face as she presented the sufuria. "Mama Ashino's cow." The transformation was immediate. The mention of the neighbor's name was apparently the wrong answer. "Charity," he roared. "You feed me charity from that gossip's mouth. You think I am a beggar." The chaos erupted as expected. The chair went over. The table was kicked. But this time, something shifted. Perhaps it was the memory of Howie's blood on the floor, or the simple need to protect this one small victory. As he reached for the sufuria of stew to dash it to the ground, Howie's mother did the unthinkable. She hugged the hot pot to her chest, let out a yelp of pain and defiance, and bolted for the door. It was so unexpected that her father stood frozen for a full second, his hand closing on empty air. In that same moment, Polo, displaying a bravery that would have made a general proud, didn't run. He lunged forward, grabbed the massive, hot ugali with both hands, and with a grunt of effort, pushed his entire body towards the door. It was less a run and more of scramble, a small boy being dragged along by a giant, edible white mound. Howie didn't try to be a hero. She just dove out of the way. The three of them converged behind the house, panting in the dark. Her mother was blowing on her chest where the hot sufuria had burned her through her dress. Polo stood triumphantly, the ugali held like a trophy. For a moment, they just stared at each other, and then Howie started to giggle. Her mother looked at Polo's proud, dirty face, the mighty ugali warrior, and a snort of laughter escaped from her bruised throat. Soon, all three of them were shaking with silent laughter. They ate in the dark, hidden between the wall and the euphorbia fence, using their fingers. They tore off chunks of ugali and dipped them into the meaty stew. They didn't speak. They just ate, their laughter subsiding. It was the best meal they had ever tasted. When they were done, the night air was cold. Going back inside was not an option. Howie looked at the clothesline, where the day's washing. A few shirts, a pair of trousers, their school uniforms, was still hanging, stiff and dry in the cool night. "Come," she said to Polo. They pulled the stiff, sun-dried clothes from the line. They spread the larger items on the ground for a makeshift mattress and used the smaller ones as blankets. Lying there, curled up together under a scratchy shirt and a faded lesso, with the wide, starry sky for a roof, it was almost peaceful. Polo, nestled between his mother and sister, whispered, "We should have meat more often." In the darkness, Howie and her mother exchanged a look, and for the first time in a very long time, they smiled. It was a small victory, a night spent sleeping on a bed of laundry, but for tonight it was enough. They had saved the food and they had each other. Chapter 4. Some fights were about food. Some were about money or pride or the sheer need to dominate. Today's fight was different. It was silent and swift and about nothing at all. Howie and Polo were doing their homework at the small table when their father came in. He didn't shout. He didn't demand. He just stood in the doorway, his eyes scanning the small kitchen before landing on their mother, who was wiping a plate with a quiet, tired rhythm. He crossed the room in 3 strides. There were no words. He simply grabbed a fistful of her hair, and with a force that seemed to suck the air out of the room, smashed her head against the mud brick wall. It wasn't the loud, dramatic thud of movies. It was a heavy, sickening crunch, the sound of a melon breaking. Her mother made a small, guttural sound, and then her body went limp. She slid down the wall and collapsed on the floor in a silent heap. For a moment, there was absolute silence. Even Polo's breathing had stopped. Then a scream tore from Howie's throat. "Mama!" The scream was out of pure shock. Not meant to raise alarm. She knew the neighbors wouldn't come. They had termed it a losing battle at some point in time that Howie couldn't recall now. She didn't look at her father. The damage was done. She scrambled to her mother's side, her knees skidding on the hard floor. "Mama, Mama, get up," she pleaded, her hands grabbing her mother's shoulders, shaking her. The head lolled back, frighteningly loose. A trickle of dark blood was already snaking its way from her scalp to her hairline. "Get up, please, get up," Howie chanted, the words a prayer. But she just lay there unresponsive. A lesson from school, a distant memory from a first aid club she'd joined for the free bread and soda, flashed in her mind. When someone is not breathing. Panic turned into a focused purpose. She tilted her mother's head back, just like they'd practiced on the big plastic doll. She pinched her nose, sealed her mouth over her mother's, and blew. She blew her own breath, her own life, into her mother's still mouth. She did it again, a desperate whistling sound in the quiet room. Nothing. "Breathe," Howie shrieked, the command dissolving into a sob. She started chest compressions, her small hands placed clumsily in the center of her mother's chest, pushing down with all her might. "You have to breathe." But the figure on the floor remained a thing of terrifying stillness. Her strength left her. The frantic energy vanished, and she collapsed over her mother's chest, her body shaking with great, heaving sobs. This wasn't like the other times. This was the end. He had finally done it. The world had swallowed Howie whole. "Don't leave us," she wept into her mother's dress, the fabric muffling her despair. "Please, don't leave us alone with him." She didn't know how long she lay there. It could have been a minute, it could have been an hour. But then, under her ear, she felt a faint, shuddering movement, a weak breath. Howie froze, lifting her head. Her mother's eyelids fluttered. A low moan escaped her lips, a sound of pure pain. "Mama," Howie whispered, her voice raw. Her mother's eyes opened, but they didn't see her. They were cloudy with confusion and agony. She tried to speak, but only a pained gasp came out. One hand twitched, trying to rise before falling back to the floor. Chapter 5. The world had been filled with fog for 3 days. Howie floated through school like a ghost, every sound too loud. The image of her mother's head hitting the wall replayed behind her eyes on a constant loop. Her mother was pale that morning, moving slowly as if she were trudging through mud. She'd promised, her voice a faint whisper, to bring them lunch at school. "I won't be able to make breakfast, my children," she'd said, her hand trembling as she ironed out Polo's uniform. "I will come. I will bring you lunch. Go now." Howie had clung to that promise all morning. It was a tiny hope in the cold fear that had built a home in her stomach. At break time, she and Polo stood by the school gate, their eyes scanning the paths. They watched as other children eagerly accepted wrapped containers from their mothers. By the final bell, it had burned itself out completely, and all that remained in her chest was fear. The walk home was silent. Polo, sensing her fear, did not ask questions. He just held her hand, his small grip tight. They rounded the final bend in the path, and Howie stopped dead in her tracks. Their house was crowded. A small, intimate group of neighbors from the compound. Not the loud, lively crowds that visited for a party, but a quiet shaking of heads. It was the kind of crowd that could only mean one thing. Howie did not need to be told. The news did not impose itself on her mind. It hit her in the gut. A blow that knocked the breath from her body. A scream was torn from her throat, a raw wail that tore through the afternoon air. It was a sound of such pure anguish that adults in the vicinity turned as one, their faces filled with pity. She did not run. Her legs carried her forward, heavy and numb. Her father was standing in the doorway, looking strangely small and bewildered, as if he too had stumbled onto a scene he could not understand. From the corner of her eye, Howie saw Polo. He didn't scream. He didn't cry. With a guttural sound too large for his 7-year-old body, he threw himself at his father. He sank his teeth into the man's forearm and hung there, a small, furious pendulum, his feet kicking in the air. The man yelled in shock and pain, trying to brush him off, but Polo held fast, a mixture of grief and rage, his entire world focused on this one brutal act of revenge. Howie did not stop. She walked past the spectacle, past the murmuring neighbors, and into the house. Someone had laid her mother on her bed. She wasn't moving, too still. The vibrant, exhausted, loving woman who had bathed them and played with them and fallen asleep over laundry with them wasn't present. In her place was a shell. The pale, dark bruise of a few days ago was now evidence of the final violence hidden beneath her hairline. A brain bleed, they would whisper later. It had been quiet and slow and fatal. Howie looked at the woman who had been her entire universe. And as the compound outside was filled with the noise of her brother's anger and her father's protests, Howie felt nothing but a vast, silent emptiness. The house was his now, truly his. Chapter 6. The soil they threw onto the plain. Wooden coffins sounded hollow, final. The funeral was small and shameful. The neighbors kept a distance, their muttered prayers apologetic more than anything. The local chief spoke words that hung false and empty in the air. "It's a terrible accident that's befallen this family," he stated, not looking at the children. "A woman can easily fall in the dark. Let that be a lesson to all of you to take care." Howie stood rigid, holding Polo's hand. A fall. The lie was a blanket smothering the truth. She saw the knowing looks that went around among the adults, the guilty glances. They knew, everybody knew. And in their silent knowing, they were complicit. Justice was for other people in other places. The house that night was different. The soul of the house had been buried that morning. Their father was sitting in his chair, the dim light of the kerosene lamp casting harsh shadows on his face. He did not look like a widower in mourning. The new routine began immediately. Howie made the ugali. She served him. She cleaned the pot. Her movements were mechanical, her body going through the motions. She placed his food before him and he grunted, took a bite, then knocked the plate from the table, china shattering on the wall. "Too cold," he snarled. "Can't you do anything right? You're just like your mother." The anger of before was all focused on her now. She was the new receptacle for all his rage, his frustration, his poison. Polo, temporarily, was thankfully forgotten. A small ghost in the corner. That night, Howie dragged the old wooden chair and wedged it into the doorknob of her rotten, wooden kitchen door. It was a child's idea of a barrier. Polo was asleep already, exhausted from crying, his breath hitching in his sleep. Howie waited in the dark. The wind rustled the leaves. She closed her eyes and prayed for the sun. And then she heard it, the drunken, stumbling footsteps. They stopped in front of the kitchen door. The handle turned, slowly at first, then more forcefully. The chair legs scraped across the floor, complaining with a shriek. The door opened in. His figure filled the doorway, large and threatening, blocking the faint moonlight. The smell hit her first, the strong smell of cheap alcohol and sweat. He simply stood there, staring at her, his breathing slow in the quiet room. "You," he slurred, his voice thick. "You look like her." Howie froze. She could not breathe. She could not scream. This was it, the final violation. A faint whimper came from the other mat. Polo shifted in his sleep, mumbling, "Mama." The sound was small, but it shattered the alcoholic daze. Her father's head snapped in the direction of the sound. He stood for another moment, trying to make up his mind. Then, with a grunt, he turned and shuffled away, leaving the door open. Howie did not sleep. She lay until the dawn light filtered through the window, shivering with a cold that had seeped into her bones. Her father ate the breakfast she prepared the next morning without looking at her. Polo was quiet, his eyes wide as he stared at his sister. The voices of the teachers at school felt distant. Howie looked out of the window but did not see the playing field. She saw a door open and a dark figure. She saw a grave. When the final bell sounded, she walked home, each step heavier than the last. She stopped at the gate, looking up at the mud brick house. It was where her mother had died and the girl she used to be had been buried. Polo pushed his hand into hers, his small fingers seeking warmth. She looked down at him, at the fear in his eyes that mirrored her own. And in it, the cold in her hardened into a resolve. She would not die here. She led Polo inside, back straight, eyes dry. She would cook. She would clean. She would endure. She made a silent vow, a promise to her mother's memory and to the brother she had left behind for her to protect. She would bide her time. She would gather her strength. And one day she would walk out of her father's house and never look back.